Well, hi there. My name is Void Ghost, and today, actually, this is a second video in a row, but I'm gonna post this in a week after the first one. You see, I talked about how you start a war, and now I'd like to talk about, are there any good wars? Now, what's a good war? Well, let's say you actually help some people. Let's say you actually help humanity, maybe in some way, perhaps in a way you didn't actually think of. So, are there actually wars that, in essence, are something that, let's say, propel humanity forward, advance humanity, change for the better? Let's see. You see, when we look at wars and the first ones at that, usually it's one nation conquering others, spreading its ownership. And even then, people know that holding an occupation force somewhere is a kind of a hard thing. So usually they would make a kind of vassal um, kingdom or territory that would pay some tribute or would have to raise some troops in a war that the overlord would fight in, right? And they would be on their own. And if someone attacked them, they could actually count on some force being sent to help them. So losing that war, in perspective, it could have been kind of beneficial, but this, I think, changed mostly or most drastically during the reign of the Roman Empire, because then you had more and more territories incorporated into the Roman Empire. And after the initial struggle, allying themselves with the weakest faction in the region, and then taking over the territory, then the next one, then the next one, you would have this period of building small cities, trading, and the marvels of the Roman Empire presented to the locals. And after you get a taste of the technology that they had, how useful it made, how useful it was, and how easy it could make, or luxurious make life for everyone that had access to those technologies. For example, there was a situation where uh, a tribal, a son of a tribal chieftain, Germanic chieftain, was kind of introduced into, and this was a provincial, neighboring, small, tiny city made by the Romans. He goes into one of their beautiful houses, right? The white pillars and the walls, and everything looks like a palace, basically. And he sees that, or feels that, the floor is warm. Yes, because they had technology where they would send pump warm water beneath the floors through pipes, I think, and warm it up. So, there's a movie about Attila the Hun. The Huns were the invading force before the Mongols. So the Huns happened to Europe around 4th, 5th century. The Mongols, I think, were the 12th century. And there's Attila, who saw who's a leader of the Huns, and he saw in Rome warm baths, for example, and he tries to reproduce one of them, and there are huge problems. He took the smartest guys in his tribe to try to do that, and they had huge problems. Eventually, they kind of did it, knowing that it can be done, right? But you got to understand that for some people living in huts in some area like that, this was a leap in technology like nothing they could have imagined, really. So, was it all bad being a part of Rome? Well, no, of course not. It was actually very good. Of course, if you're living in a small country and someone says, okay, that neighboring country, well, wouldn't it be great if it just annexed you and made it part of its own, because it's richer and it's bigger and has its army and has its infrastructure? Usually the smaller country would say, no, we want to keep our independence, right? But eventually it might be beneficial. Of course, yeah, the population doesn't have to agree to those benefits, really. Let me give you an example. For example, the forces of Napoleon took Italy, right? And in northern Italy, you actually had a very poor system of healthcare. Actually, there was no system of healthcare, pretty much. So the invaders built a set of hospitals and they introduced a whole health care system. And after they were pushed out, the Italians destroyed that and pushed their technology in that area back 100 years. So you could say, wow, that's weird, right? Well, if you look at some of the territories that were part of the Soviet Republic after it fell apart, the infrastructure that was built there quite often was lost. So basically, it wasn't maintained. It stopped functioning. Was that done on purpose? No, perhaps not. But the thing is, when you get your freedom, let's put it like that. That doesn't mean you're going to be better off. Even if you look at the United States and the war, if you look at the War of Independence, okay, yeah, that transferred the United States from being just a colony to an independent, huge nation. Well, it wasn't so huge at first, but the 13 colonies took more and more territory eventually. So, and what we have today is possible only because of that war of independence. But what about the North-South War? Well, it wasn't really about slavery that much. That was just one of the issues, but it was the Secession War, right? So, what if the South won? And you could say, well, the Southerners would be great off, right? Having those territories detached from the rest of the country, but that's not the case. You see, the southern territories were not that much developed. There was production of cotton, mostly, of foodstuff, basically. But industry was in the north, and industry at that point was very, very important. So actually cutting off themselves from the north in the perspective would not be good for that region. So not everything you might want is good for your country, basically, right? And what you think you might want in that case might not be something that is good for you as a part of that country. But what about other benefits? Are there any benefits? Well, there is one case, and I can give you the specifics of a war that advances humanity as a whole in a way. You see, this war has to go on for quite a bit, and it has to be a struggle that neither side can decisively win for a long, long time, but those sides must be rather huge. They might be allied nations, they might be one empire, whatever the case, you have to have this push, steady push, but it kind of is met with resistance all the time. And you don't have a shifting border, vast amounts of land going one way or another. You just have this struggle. Which struggle, for example, could I mention? World War One is such an example. You basically have very small moves at the front, but you have enormous development of technology. And someone could say, well, yeah, but they developed gas to gas the enemy and airplanes to bomb and shoot at the enemy and enemy airplanes, tanks, to kill that infantry. And there were other stuff, the other things, including tactics, and all those were developed there, but nothing was really to benefit people. It was just to kill them, right? Oh yeah, but all those technologies developed then, submarines, for example, took a leap forward. They were developed then through a few years that the war took 4 years to finish, and they benefited the population. They were developed because they were needed. If there was no war, you wouldn't see that push to make those technologies happen. So let's say something else would happen. You would have an advanced nation fighting really, well, backwater nation, some nation that wasn't developed. What happens then? Well, there's not really much benefit in technology or technology advancement to that developed nation. It basically overruns that other one. It can fight, sure, it can lose some people. Maybe that underdeveloped nation is going to get some technology in effect, but probably not. It's probably going to get devastated. It's going to be worse off after the war, and the more advanced nation is going to be better off for some time, but it's not going to push technology forward. And then we have another huge war, of course, World War II, and technology was developed even more during that time. I mean, you could say atomic bombs, those were the last weapon used, really. They tipped the scale, at least when Japan was left to fight against the United States. Sure, and you could say, "Wow, that's bad." We have, a looming threat of nuclear war now. Yes, but you also have nuclear power plants. All the technology around that was developed, was pushed forward, was proven to be real and doable, because the war went on and on and on, and they want some super weapon. And what about Germany? Oh my goodness, what they developed. Of course, you had jet engines. What engines are we using now in every plane? Pretty much. You go across the seas, you go visit another country. biplane, yes, it's a jet plane. You got jet engines. But was only Germany developing those? No. Actually, other countries also had their prototypes, just were a bit back, and they didn't make it in time, basically. But after the war, everybody saw that this is the way to go. But all those projects were developed because the war lasted and went on, and new weapons were needed. And there were numerous small advances in different types of warfare. For example, submarines eventually developed magnetic torpedoes. Earlier, there were acoustic torpedoes. You got bigger, better submarines that could submerge more. Well, when you look at that, you may think, well, okay, so submarines, not something that benefits humanity that much. Well, yes, but you could look at ships, and as naval military ships were, they tried to improve them. This, in ways, of course, benefited normal shipping. Nowadays, it's very hard to sink something that's properly made. Sometimes that happens, of course, but you have, say, these huge transports going with various products across the seas. You don't see them sinking, for example, right? Where do you think some advancements in shipbuilding, or the speed of how you build ships, or planes, or tanks, that means also cars, or a washer dryer, that technology, or the development of how fast you can do this stuff, that's immediately used by the civilian sector. And what else? Well, some things, they're kind of drastic, because you had experiments, Nazi experiments, and they definitely did prove some stuff. They checked how, for example, a rapid change of pressure kills a person, right? But it wasn't really known. Nobody really studied that. And you could say, well, that's a nasty thing to know. Of course it is, of course. But it's just knowledge. It's just something that helps other technologies. Something that normally you would really have struggled to kind of find out. And that doesn't mean, of course, that I'm in any way supporting that, but you're kind of seeing this for the last maybe 30 years, this attitude that if technology, a certain piece of it, was developed by evil people in evil ways, then you should discard it, which is total nonsense, of course, because one piece of technology leads to another. That's always the case. And whatever it is, and whatever way it was developed, it can be used by humanity. That's it. And another thing, blood transfusions. I think, again, Nazi Germany developed this. Of course, where did they get their blood? Prisoners. That doesn't mean the prisoner was drained of all blood, but they kind of pushed that a lot forward. Even you had the SS troops. They had a tattoo with their blood type under their left arm, if I remember correctly. And why? Because if such a trooper was wounded, then you could look there as a doctor and see, oh yeah, you need a transfusion of this blood type. So nowadays, you're going to have a dog tag or something, right, indicating that. But those methods of conduct were kind of developed, and technologies that normally wouldn't were. And why? Because one or another nation felt that it has to. And why did it have to? Because the war was going on and on. And suddenly you have either better equipment, better technology, or you're going to be left behind and the enemy is going to develop their technology and they're going to squash you. And of course, uh, V1 and V2 rockets, V1 rockets, you programmed them and they flew in a path and then hit a target, like London, for example. So understand the leap in that, right? You had machines that were programmed to do things over such a distance at that point. And V2 rockets, they were half ballistic, so they didn't really leave orbit, but they went very, very high and then went rapidly down. So that was even a bigger advance. This actually led directly to the Apollo space program. Even von Braun, the guy in charge of developing these V2 rockets, was then took by the USA and basically put in charge of the program. And that's a good move, honestly, because when you have a scientist, you don't really want to think of, yeah, maybe he was working with these guys. Okay, right. He has knowledge. He can develop technology, whatever the circumstances you want that because it's going to benefit humanity in a way. And it's, of course, going to benefit your country. No doubt about that. So you can go on and on about the technologies that were gained in those wars. But if there's not this proportion, this prolonged struggle, so you have to have a certain, usually landmass, right? You have to be unable, as one or the other side, to strike a decisive blow quickly. And you have to have a prolonged struggle, and that means usually a lot of casualties. Because if you have a war where the both sides kind of get to one point and they kind of stop fighting, that's not gonna do much. It's just gonna bankrupt them eventually, uh, unless they get to that point, sit down basically, and try different technologies to hit the enemy somehow. Anyway, the truth is that we as human beings developed mostly because of wars. Sometimes it was this huge, enormous, and long lasting war, but quite often it was just the threat of war. The fact that you got those other guys over there and you have to prepare. And maybe you just make fortifications. Maybe you develop better weapons for your soldiers. Whatever the case, you need to think of them and their impending invasion, even if it didn't happen ever. You developed your country. You developed technology. You had to. Normally, if you don't have to, you won't. And that's the driving force behind development during wartime. And I think that's pretty much enough on the subject. I think so, at least. Uh, so this one's going to be relatively short because if you like it, thank you for watching. I hope I didn't bore you, and goodbye. See you next time.